Good afternoon, everyone. Wanted to touch on a subject that we were not able to get in during class time, and that is the idea of Eastern Absolutism. Now, earlier in our exploration and absolutism unit, we had looked at the model of Western absolutism, basically using the ideas of France and Spain to set up our model for what Western absolutism looked like. To contrast that, we need to look now at what we'll refer to as Eastern absolutism. What went on in Central and Eastern Europe during the time period of Louis XIII, Louis XIV in France, etc. Basically, if you look at Eastern Europe, you'll see three major states emerge during the 1600s and early 1700s. One is Austria, the land that is now modern Austria that was run by the Habsburg Empire. Second was Brandenburg, Prussia, okay, scattered holdings in Central Europe that became one of the strongest states in all of Europe during that time period, and what is basically what we now know as Germany. The third is Russia. And Russia gains new stature during this time period for two reasons. One is the weakening of Poland as a major power. Yes, at one time Poland was a major power. Guffaw. The second is the ascension to power of Peter the Great, who will become one of the great game changers in European history. So what I want to do now is take a look at that model that we will call Eastern Absolutism. I want to compare it to what we know as Western Absolutism, basically Louis XIV's reign in France. And then I want to set up the model of emergence in Austria and in Prussia in this piece of what I do. Okay? Let me start out with a couple of notes about what these folks had in common. Okay, and you can basically say that all three of these states had two major thoughts in common. One, they are all in fierce competition for territory. They spend the better part of a century and a half squabbling with each other over the land that we now know as Central Europe. Okay. At various times, you'll see small states under control of different of these three major states during the time period. The second thing is that all three gain power and stability via the political model of absolutism. Now, what we have to do is understand that Eastern absolutism is a much different animal than the Western model as portrayed by France. So what I want to do is to give you some idea as to how and what those differences look like. Okay, I want to use Louis XIV as a model. Okay, when you look at Louis' France, you see three major things that are distinguishable. One, Louis had an efficient and very effective bureaucracy. Lesser nobility, middle-class officials made up Louis' royal bureaucracy. You didn't see landed people in places of authority under Louis. There was a reason for that. Louis despised the landed nobles, and he wanted them kept under control. Second point is that all of France's regional and town councils during the reign of the Louis were made up primarily of middle-class merchants. So you see an emergent middle class in French and generally Western absolutism. The third thing that comes to mind is the idea that all French peasants were free from serfdom, i.e., they weren't tied to the land. They weren't expected to remain on the land for life, and they had some sense of mobility. They could move from place to place. So if you look at French rule, you'll see those three things. Now let's flip and look at what happens in Eastern Absolutism. And again, there are striking differences. The first difference is that under the Eastern model, land-owning nobility had tremendous power, and in many cases wielded more power than the kings themselves. The kings could find themselves in major difficulty if they ran afoul of the landowners in their countries. The landowners often put them in power, backed their armies, and did things that solidified the absolutist model. The second major difference is that there was no middle class in Eastern Absolutism. None. Okay? There was no merchandising. There was no merchant class. There was very little outside trade. Everything was land dominated, and if you owned land, you were in good shape. If you didn't, you were likely to be a peasant tied to the land for life and not with a lot of hope for progress. The third major difference is that peasants were bound to the land as serfs. So they were basically providing slave service to the landowning nobility. Their lot in life was pretty much you stay alive by farming the land and by getting what the noble will provide. Don't plan on progress. Don't plan on movement. You're where you're at. Okay? In part 2 of this, I'm going to take a look at Austria and at Brandenburg, Prussia.